That was the plan. The whole damn thing. 6 chapters of calculated delicious vengeance, all wrapped up in the kind of slow-burn suspense my audience, you, crave. They say the devil is in the details. I say the truth is. And the devil? She's waiting for her final curtain call. My stepmother hid my mother's will for 10 years. I found it hidden in a library book that only my mother and I knew the Dewey decimal number 4. Have you ever lost everything, not in a fiery cinematic crash, but in a slow, suffocating whisper? Have you watched a woman weep crocodile tears on the stand, clutching a diamond necklace your dead mother bought, all while the judge calls her the legal heir? Is there a more profound betrayal than witnessing your most sacred memories systematically dismantled by a stranger wearing your dead parents' smile? These aren't rhetorical questions. They are the nails in the coffin of my former life. Before we dive into the wreckage, and trust me, it's a beautiful mess, allow me a moment. You're about to step behind closed doors. This isn't a gossip column. It's a chronicle of calculated justice. If you want to know how the rich, the powerful, and the utterly ruthless operate when the lights are off, you need to subscribe to Behind Closed Doors and hit that notification bell right now. You won't want to miss the moment the other shoe drops. Trust me, it's going to be loud. They called the courtroom ruling a tragedy. I called it Chapter 1, The Hook. I walked out of that mahogany-paneled room, and the bright Washington afternoon sun felt like a spotlight on my utter failure. Victoria, my stepmother, the woman who had meticulously woven a decade of lies, had just been awarded the estate, the house, and the controlling interest in the small, successful publishing firm my mother had built from scratch. My home, my legacy. The law, with all its grand pronouncements of justice, had sided with the person who manufactured the most convincing grief. The original will was tragically lost in a document-shredding incident during the move, her slimy lawyer had stated, his voice dripping with faux sympathy. Lost? Victoria didn't lose things. Victoria erased things. I knew the truth with a clarity that cut through the legal jargon and the public relations spin. My mother's will wasn't lost. Victoria had hidden it for 10 years, manipulating my kind, naive father into believing the legal framework was too complex to challenge. He bought it. The judge bought it. The world bought it. Except for me. I stood there, a 28-year-old orphan, disinherited not by malice, but by the sheer, unadulterated greed of a woman who was a master of the sweet-tea-and-venom performance. I lost everything, yes. But I hadn't lost one thing. I hadn't lost my memory. Specifically, the memory of a bookworm's secret. Are you leaving so soon, darling? Victoria's voice, a saccharine velvet glove wrapped around a steel fist, pulled me from my thoughts. She was standing by the courthouse steps, her makeup flawless, her smile too wide. It's been a stressful day for us all. Your father and I are having a small, private celebration at the house tonight. You understand? The house, the home where my mother's ghost still wandered the halls, now hosting a party to celebrate my stepmother's triumph. I understand perfectly, Victoria, I said, my voice flat, empty of the fight I was saving for later. Don't mistake silence for surrender. That's a lesson my mother taught me, and I was practicing it beautifully. As I drove away, the full weight of the moral dichotomy hit me. Victoria, draped in designer silk, holding champagne flutes in my mother's living room, represented a superficial, performative virtue, the image of the loving, supportive wife. And me? I was the dismissed, cynical daughter, the one who saw the dark seam in the beautiful tapestry. They saw me as the angry child who couldn't accept a loving stepmother. I saw myself as the only person willing to acknowledge the viper in the nest. I remembered my mother, a librarian by passion, an executive by necessity, sitting me on her knee amidst the towering bookshelves of her study, the study that was now Victoria's vanity room. "Ilara?" she'd say, her hand running over the spine of a worn novel. "The most important thing isn't the book itself. It's the space it holds. It's the place it stands." It was her favorite aphorism, a comment on the permanence of knowledge, the structure of the world, and the Dewey decimal system. an obscure library classification system. Useless information to most. But to my mother, the former head librarian who had me organizing her personal collection before I could tie my shoes, the Dewey decimal system was a language of coded meaning. A map. They said the will was lost. They said it was burned. They sold my mother's cherished first edition collection just last week to clean up the study. They forgot one simple, profound truth. I am my mother's daughter, and my mother never left a secret unsecured. The will, the truth, the whole damn thing was hidden in plain sight, encoded using a system only 2 people in the entire world ever truly understood. And Victoria wasn't one of them. Victoria sold the books, but she didn't know which space to check. It was time to pay my first visit back home, not as a grieving daughter, but as a thief coming to steal back what was rightfully mine. I had a deadline, the next day, when the locks were officially changed. I didn't need a key. I needed the library, and I needed to find a clue that was almost certainly still there, waiting for me. A 10-year-old clue, tucked away, small enough to be invisible, significant enough to change everything. My heart hammered against my ribs. This wasn't about money anymore. This was about honoring the intelligence of a woman who prepared for the betrayal and delivering a long-overdue retribution to the woman who thought she'd won. The game was just starting. You've confirmed. The silence from my end, the lack of a victorious outburst. That's the power of silence. Victoria expected hysterics, maybe a thrown glass of water. She got nothing but cold, absolute focus. That's what sets this story apart. We're not victims here. We're strategists. Chapter 2. The Soft Knife. Escalation in Subtext. The night of Victoria's private celebration was my night for reconnaissance. I didn't need a grappling hook. I still had my father's old garage code, a sentimental, stupid sequence of numbers my stepmother had never bothered to change. She probably assumed my grief would keep me away. Bad calculation. Grief is just focused energy, waiting for a target. I slipped through the side entrance and into the suffocating reality of my loss. The house was loud. Too loud. The muffled sound of high society laughter and the clinking of crystal glasses felt like a physical assault. My sanctuary had become a stage for my adversary's victory party. My objective wasn't in the gilded ballroom or the sprawling kitchen. It was the small, unassuming library tucked away behind the conservatory. My mother's space. My refuge. I moved through the shadows of the long hallway, a ghost in my own home. I could hear Victoria's voice now, louder, closer. She was performing for her guests. Oh, darling, it was such a grueling day in court. I know poor Alara is heartbroken, she cooed, her voice carrying that perfect pitch of affected sorrow. She's such a sensitive child, but a home like this, well, it needs a steady hand. Someone organized. That's just what the judge decided. Someone organized. That was the subtext. You, Alara, are too emotional, too scattered to manage this fortune. I flattened myself against the wall, near the library door. The air here smelled of old paper, and dust motes dancing in the single beam of moonlight, the only part of the house Victoria hadn't managed to sanitize. A sharp, guttural voice broke through the polite chatter. It was my father. Victoria, are you really selling Margaret's books so soon? My father, bless his weak heart. He loved my mother, but he was putty in Victoria's hands, a decent man paralyzed by his own avoidance. Victoria's reply was immediate and laced with that infuriating gentle firmness. Dearest, they're just things. Sentimental clutter. This house needs lightness. I'm having a specialist come next week. We'll keep a few of the more decorative ones, of course. But those stacks of old, musty novels, it's simply time to let go. Let go. That's how she phrased her theft. She wasn't stealing, she was cleaning. She wasn't erasing my mother's final words. She was introducing lightness. That was the act of emotional betrayal I had been waiting for. Selling the books, not the Persian rugs, not the antique silver. The books. the physical manifestation of my mother's identity. The books were the battlefield. I pushed the library door open slowly. Inside, the shelves were already starting to look sparse. Victoria hadn't waited. The specialists had clearly taken the bulk of the rare, easily sellable volumes. But I wasn't looking for value. I was looking for a message in a bottle. My mother was a creature of habit. The books she truly loved, the ones she used as mental anchors, weren't shelved randomly. She had an internal logic. She taught me, chaos is for amateurs. A true code hides in perfect order. I ran my fingers across the remaining spines, inhaling the familiar scent of aging paper and leather. Most of her literary fiction was gone. All the weighty, canonical stuff. Only her collection of vintage cookbooks, a few gardening manuals, and a small shelf dedicated to American crime fiction, pre-1970, remained. Victoria must have thought these were worthless. I remembered the clue. The one my mother had dropped years ago, not as a warning, but as a lesson. The place it stands. I moved directly to the cookbook section. Not because the will would be in a recipe book. That was too obvious. But because my mother had often used books she didn't care about as placeholders or covers for her codes. I started pulling out the biggest, stiffest cookbooks. And there it was. Tucked deep inside a massive, ugly binder titled Mid-Century Culinary Classics, I found it, a small, stiff piece of yellowed paper. It was a library checkout slip. It looked ancient, from the public library branch where she had worked 2 decades ago. My heart didn't just beat. It thrummed. The slip was for a book she had borrowed just days before she passed away. The title didn't matter. The author didn't matter. What mattered was the number written precisely on the top corner, in her elegant, distinctive script. 8130 Efri 52 B391C. I gripped the slip so hard my knuckles turned white. It wasn't a random note. It was the Dewey decimal number, the exact classification code, for a very specific book. A piece of American crime fiction from the 1930s. A memory flashed. I was 8. Mom was reading to me from that book, a story about a librarian who hid the evidence in the least checked out section of the library. We had laughed about how obvious, yet brilliant it was. Victoria, you sold all the Hemingway and all the Woolf. You thought you cleaned house. But you didn't understand the grammar of my mother's love. I pulled out my phone. 8113 52 B3C1C. I didn't need Google. I needed to confirm the significance of the code. My internal monologue screamed, "She used the only language you never learned, Victoria. She trusted the system you despised." I quietly slipped out of the house. The sound of the party faded behind me. The rush of adrenaline was intense, cold, and absolute. I had the coordinates. I had the map. The will wasn't in the house. It was waiting for me in the last place anyone, especially Victoria, would ever think to look. The public library. The library where my mother had worked, where she had learned her code, and where she had stored the ultimate truth. The only question now was whether that book, borrowed 10 years ago, was still sitting quietly on a dusty shelf, and whether Victoria, in her decade of searching, had ever once considered that the solution to her problem was measured in 3 digits, a decimal and a letter. Doubtful. She only ever saw the price tag. The next stop wasn't a courtroom. It was the temple of my childhood. You confirmed the coordinates were set. I had just traded a silk dress for a pair of black jeans and an old trench coat, my uniform for a midnight rendezvous with the truth. Victoria's laughter, echoing faintly behind the closed door of the mansion, was the last thing I needed to hear to solidify my purpose. She celebrated too early, a mistake amateurs make. Chapter 3. The Library Heist, the Procedural. The Northside Public Library hadn't changed. It smelled exactly the same. A comforting mixture of old paper, floor polish, and the faint, acidic scent of photocopier toner. It was closed, of course, but as a child, this was my second home, and as a former student intern, I knew the blind spots of the motion detectors better than the night security guard knew his own rotation. I didn't break in. I used the old chipped key my mother had given me years ago, a piece of brass she'd kept just in case I ever needed a quiet place to think after hours. A gift that now felt less like sentiment and more like foresight. The hall was dark and cavernous. I moved quickly, my steps muffled by the deep carpet. I didn't head for the main checkout desk. I went straight to the staff offices, to the small, windowless cubicle of Mrs. Peterson, my mother's oldest friend and former colleague. Mrs. Peterson was a librarian in the classical sense, sharp, private, and possessed of a frighteningly comprehensive knowledge of records. I needed one thing from her files: the circulation history. I had to breach her privacy, but this wasn't time for moral deliberation. Justice demands certain sacrifices. I found her private logbook under a stack of overdue notices, a beautiful, leather-bound artifact she'd used for decades. Finding the login code for the antiquated system was easier. It was the birth date of her favorite cat. I typed in the query, my mother's name, Margaret Alara Vance. Time frame, the 2 weeks leading up to her death, 10 years ago. The screen flickered. The silence of the library was suddenly deafening, punctuated only by the hum of the old server room. Then, the data populated. My heart jumped. Only one book was checked out in those 2 weeks. The date was exactly 48 hours before she died, and the Dewey decimal number? 852, B391C. The blood drained from my face, not from shock, but from the sudden powerful confirmation. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a plan. My mother, dying, suspicious of the woman who was slowly ingratiating herself into our lives, had taken her most important document and hidden it not in a Swiss bank or a safety deposit box, but in a place that only I, her bookish daughter, would ever think to look. A librarian's final, brilliant riddle. Victoria knew how to raid bank accounts. She didn't know how to navigate the American crime fiction shelf. I rushed out of the office and into the stacks. The 800s, literature. Specifically, the 8 Wagner-Threens, American fiction. The fluorescent lights in the high stacks buzzed, making me feel like an extra in a Cold War spy film. The shelves seemed endless, intimidating, each spine mocking my urgency. Finally, I found the section. 81352, writers whose work spanned the mid-century. The space was dusty, clearly ignored. Victoria had been right about one thing. These were just old, musty novels. To everyone but me. I searched the shelf meticulously, spine by spine. B391C. The author's name was Barnaby. The title was The Careful Curator. My fingers found the correct spot. The space was tight. The book was still there. 10 years. Untouched. The cover was brittle. The color faded. Victoria had missed the most valuable item in the entire estate because it was valued only by classification, not by dollar amount. I pulled the book out. It felt heavy. Too heavy. I opened it, my breath catching in my throat. I didn't see a will instantly. I saw something even more telling. The inside cover was slightly warped, almost glued shut, and inside the subtle depression of the cover, a large plastic freezer bag, the heavy-duty kind my mother always used for document protection, was meticulously taped and sealed along the edges. This wasn't just a hidden document. This was a vault. And then I saw it, a faint, precise slice in the plastic bag near the corner. It was tiny, almost invisible, but clearly a cut made by a sharp object. Internal monologue. Victoria found it. My blood ran cold. She knew it was here. I checked the contents, ripping the seal I'd found. My hands were shaking too hard to be steady. Inside the bag were the crisp, legally binding pages of my mother's last will and testament. Signed. Witnessed. Original. But Victoria had cut the bag. Why? Why hadn't she destroyed the will? Then I saw the document beneath the will. A crisp, yellowed, handwritten note, sealed separately with a wax seal that bore my mother's unique librarian stamp. The letter, I read the letter first. My mother's elegant script was unflinching. My dearest Alara, if you are reading this, Victoria has survived me. I'm afraid I didn't trust her. The will is valid. Victoria cut the bag. I know she did, to check for cash or jewels. But she didn't destroy it because she didn't understand the first sentence. It is written in the legal terminology of the Commonwealth Act of 1948, which she never bothered to study. She only knows the glamour. She knows nothing of the rules. She will assume the document is too old to be valid and hide it in the safest place she knew, the obscurity of the library, believing she can retrieve it later if the house search proves fruitless. This will give her a temporary sense of control. I choked back a sob that was half sorrow, half profound respect. My mother had anticipated the exact method of her rival's calculation. Victoria hadn't known what the legal jargon meant, so she panicked and re-hid it, assuming the ambiguity of the old document was her best temporary defense while she waited for the legal system to rule the lost will invalid. I looked at the will itself. It was dated a year before she died. And the crucial clause, the one Victoria had deemed too boring to comprehend, stood out starkly. Upon my demise, control of Vance Publishing shall be equally divided, but 51% of all non-voting shares and proxy control is hereby granted to Alara Vance, ensuring her ultimate control of the board. The remaining 49% of all assets, save for personal effects, shall be divided between my husband and, I didn't need to read the rest. 51%, not 100%. She had been fair to my father, but she had secured my future. She gave me control, not just capital. The sound of the library door opening and a flashlight beam sweeping across the main hall snapped me back to the present, the night guard. Showtime was over. I carefully tucked the documents inside my coat, replaced the heavy book on the shelf, and vanished into the darkness, leaving the scene of the crime exactly as I had found it. The game wasn't just on. The rules had just been rewritten. You confirmed. The papers were warm against my chest, a decade of dust and a lifetime of vindication resting there. I wasn't just holding a will. I was holding a judgment against Victoria. The library's stillness had given way to the rush of the city morning, but I was focused. The clock was ticking toward the ultimate confrontation. Chapter 4. The legal hammer, the multi-twist and climax. The first call I made wasn't to the police. It was to Uncle Liam. Liam Donovan was my mother's brother, a partner at a reputable old-school law firm, and crucially, the executor named in my mother's previous, non-binding will. He was fiercely loyal, but also meticulously procedural. He had been hurt and embarrassed by the court's ruling, but he was a man who believed in the letter of the law. I needed his confirmation, his procedural stamp of approval, before I marched into the lion's den. I showed up at his office, unannounced, at 7 a.m., bypassing his assistant. His office was austere, dark wood, heavy leather. "Alara, what is this?" he asked, rubbing his tired eyes. He thought I was there for an emotional breakdown. He didn't know I was there to drop a bomb. I didn't waste time. "The original will, Liam. I found it." I slid the documents across his desk. The will, pristine and sealed, and the handwritten letter from my mother. Liam's reaction was exactly what I needed. Disbelief, giving way to professional shock. He handled the documents with the reverence of an archaeologist finding a lost scroll. He immediately recognized the signatures of the witnesses, old colleagues from his firm. He recognized the paper stock. He read the first page, his glasses slipping down his nose. His eyes widened when he hit the 51% control clause. This is a legal masterpiece, Alara," he whispered, scanning the fine print. "It's airtight, and it's registered with the state archives. She just never told anyone where the original was stored. It trumps every assumption made in court. It is valid." The legal hammer had dropped, but I wanted him to see the full horror. "Read this, Liam," I ordered, pushing the last paragraph of my mother's letter toward him. The part where she described Victoria cutting the bag, trying to find cash, and then re-hiding the document because she didn't understand the legal code. Liam read it. His face, normally a polite mask of professional detachment, crumbled. The second twist hit him hard. He hadn't just lost a case. He had been successfully manipulated by a performance. She knew, he murmured, shaking his head. Victoria knew the will existed. She just played dumb. She let us believe it was lost. She sat in court, under oath, and testified that all reasonable searches had been made, that she truly believed it was destroyed. I leaned forward, my voice low and fierce. Now look at the last section of the will, Liam. The one you missed in the first draft 10 years ago because Mom slipped it in after the standard boilerplate. He found the bold, underlined text near the end. It wasn't the distribution of wealth that mattered now. It was the morality clause. Any individual named in this last will and testament who knowingly and willfully attempts to conceal, destroy, falsify, or manipulate the instruments of this legacy, or who provides false testimony regarding its existence or location in any legal proceeding, shall be immediately and permanently disbarred from receiving any portion of the estate. Liam lifted his eyes, the shock giving way to grim resolution. Alara, this changes everything. Victoria doesn't just lose the house. She loses everything. She forfeits her 49%. She committed fraud in court. And this clause is absolutely binding. This was the climax. It wasn't about the money. It was about justice porn, the satisfaction of watching a meticulous manipulator fall into the trap of her own arrogance. She was so focused on the value of the assets that she ignored the value of the procedure. "We don't call the authorities yet," I said, rising. "We call my father and Victoria. We have this meeting in my house, at the conference table she purchased last month with my mother's money. I want to see her face when she realizes she didn't just lose a case. She committed a felony." We set the time for noon. The tension was almost unbearable. I drove to the house, parked right in the circular driveway, the place Victoria usually reserved for her Mercedes. I was back on the stage, but this time, I was directing the play. My father was the first to arrive, bewildered and pale. "Alara, Liam says this is important. Victoria is furious." "It is important, Dad," I said, my voice soft. "It's about truth." Victoria swept in 10 minutes later, dressed in a sharp white suit, ready for battle. She radiated power and contempt. "This is an absolute farce, Liam," she snapped, her eyes barely glancing at me. "Alara is clearly having an emotional episode. We are not discussing this lost document again." I moved to the head of the long dining table. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "Victoria," I said, my voice cutting through the silence. "Where did you hide this document?" I pushed the copy of the will across the table. She laughed, a harsh, brittle sound. "I have no idea, Alara. We searched everywhere. It was lost." "Liar," I said, using the blunt, simple word that hit harder than any legal argument. I pushed the second piece of evidence, the handwritten letter and the specific description of the tiny cut in the plastic bag. "The public library. Shelf 81352, B901C. You looked at the will, realized you didn't understand the Commonwealth Act of 1948 terminology, and because you only understand greed, you were afraid to destroy it and re-hid it in the most obscure place you could imagine, hoping to retrieve it later. You committed fraud under oath in a court of law, and my mother saw you coming a decade ago." Victoria's practiced smile evaporated. Her eyes went wide, the mask shattering completely. She went white, staring at the description of the cut in the bag. It was the detail no one but the perpetrator could have known. The detail that damned her. The dining room, usually a testament to Victoria's excessive taste, became an execution chamber. The only movement was the slow, deliberate turning of the legal documents in Uncle Liam's hands. My father sat there, a broken man finally seeing the truth about the woman he'd blindly protected. He couldn't speak. He just stared at the woman who had used his grief as her ladder. Victoria found her voice, but it was thin, stripped of its saccharine varnish. "This is insane. This is a forgery. It's 10 years old. It's been compromised. You're trying to blackmail me, Alara." "It's not blackmail, Victoria," I corrected, leaning back. The power dynamic irrevocably shifted. It's a legal formality, and it's not a forgery. Liam? Uncle Liam, the man who had always treated her with professional courtesy, now addressed her with the cold clarity of the law. Victoria, the document is authenticated. The witnesses are alive and prepared to testify. More importantly, we have the original, which supersedes the court's assumption of loss. You testified under oath that you had conducted all reasonable searches and believed the will to be destroyed. You were in possession of the original document, or at least you knew where it was, and you willfully concealed it. That, coupled with the morality clause in the will. He paused, letting the silence do its work. The morality clause. The final, elegant nail in her coffin. The clause states that any attempt to manipulate or conceal this document results in the forfeiture of all rights to the estate. You are disinherited, Victoria. You lose everything. Not only that, but we have evidence you broke into a sealed container to assess the contents, then lied to the court. We can press criminal charges for perjury and theft of legal documents. Her jaw trembled. She tried one last, desperate grab for control, the dramatic language coming back, but it sounded hollow. You can't do this to me. I dedicated 10 years of my life to this family. I took care of your father. You are cruel, Ilara. You are just a vindictive child. I am the owner of Vance Publishing and the legal heir to this estate, Victoria, I stated, the phrase tasting like sweet, hard-earned victory. And I am not doing this to you. You did this to yourself. My mother taught me that integrity is a classification system you can't fake. You had no integrity. My father finally spoke, his voice hoarse. Victoria, did you know it was there? Did you lie to me? She looked at him, and for the first time, I saw genuine fear replace the malice. She realized she had not only lost the money, but the protection of the one good man she'd managed to manipulate. I panicked, Robert, she stammered, using his full name for effect. It was old. I thought it was worthless. I was only protecting our interests. Protecting your interests, Liam corrected flatly. You saw the Dewey decimal number on the book in the library and realized it was a clue. You went to the library, you found the book, and you cut the bag. But you didn't destroy it because you were afraid of destroying something valuable you didn't understand. Your greed saved the will, Victoria. Your stupidity cost you everything. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The catharsis for me was watching the life drain from her carefully constructed facade. The woman who wore Chanel and spoke in polished whispers was reduced to a defeated cheat. I didn't ask her to leave. I didn't yell. I used the power of my newfound authority. Liam will handle the paperwork, I said, addressing him but looking directly at Victoria. The locks on the main doors will be changed by 8 p.m. You have until then to remove your personal belongings. Anything left behind will be donated to charity. Don't touch anything that belonged to my mother. She stood up, slowly, heavily. Her white suit, which minutes ago had symbolized purity and triumph, now looked like a shroud. She didn't say goodbye to my father. She didn't look at me again. She walked out of the room in utter, humiliating silence. The silence of defeat. My father wept, not for her, but for the decade of his life he had lost to her deception. I let him mourn. The job wasn't quite done, but the most painful cut had been delivered. Victoria was not just disinherited. She was dethroned. She went from the mistress of the manor to a footnote in a legal deposition, stripped down to her original mean core. I looked around the house, my house now. I didn't see the gold leaf wallpaper Victoria had added. I saw the bookshelves, the ghosts of my mother's books, and the desk where she'd taught me the value of knowledge over wealth. Victoria had taught me a final lesson. The truth is always hidden, but never truly lost. You confirmed. The silence of the courtroom, the shock of the library, the final humiliated retreat of Victoria, all of it collapsed into the cold, quiet resolution of the final hour. The drama was finished. Now came the difficult work of resolution and meaning. Chapter 6. The Quiet Keeper, Resolution and Message. Victoria left just before the lock changes, not with a bang, but a pathetic whimper. I watched her from the window of my mother's former study, a room I now fully controlled. She didn't manage to fill her bags. She was too rattled, too defeated. She left behind all her expensive accessories, her brand new clothes. She only took a small, old briefcase. The things she valued were the things she could carry quickly. My father, Robert, was sitting in the living room, staring at the empty space where Victoria had stood. His face was etched with a decade of misplaced trust. He apologized to me, a quiet, broken apology that didn't need forgiveness. "I should have listened to you, Alara. She was so convincing." "She was," I agreed, sitting beside him. "She was the best actress money could buy." But she only read the script. She never learned the language of the stage. He had been granted the 49% of the assets originally designated for him, minus the portion that Victoria had forfeited due to the morality clause, which now legally reverted to me, making my total stake virtually 100%. He didn't want the money. He only wanted peace. He decided to step down from the publishing firm and travel. He needed to find himself again outside the orbit of either Margaret's genius or Victoria's manipulation. He needed his own space to stand in. My first act as the controlling partner of Vance Publishing was simple. I had every single one of my mother's books, the ones Victoria had ordered sold, tracked down and brought back. I spent the next week shelving them myself. The library was my catharsis. As I carefully placed the copies of American crime fiction, pre-1970, back onto the 8-113-52 shelf, I paused. The empty space left by the careful curator, the book I had moved to a climate-controlled safe, felt like a monument. I didn't sell Victoria's furniture. I donated it, piece by gaudy piece. But I didn't change the study layout. I sat down at my mother's old mahogany desk, the one she'd taught me the Dewey decimal system on. I picked up her old stamp, the one she used to seal the letter. It felt warm, solid, and utterly trustworthy. My mother didn't just leave me an inheritance, she left me a lesson in competence. She taught me that the biggest secrets aren't hidden under mountains of documents, but in the single, small detail that everyone else dismisses. She knew the lawyers would look at the obvious places. She knew Victoria would check for the immediate payoff. They never thought to check the logic of a lifelong librarian. It wasn't about being rich or powerful. It was about being precise. Internal monologue. I didn't beat Victoria because I was smarter. I beat her because I paid attention to the silence of an unused section in a library, the silence of a private code spoken between a mother and a daughter. Victoria's downfall was her arrogance. She assumed knowledge was only valuable if it was public, loud, and expensive. I leaned back in the old chair, the leather creaking slightly. The whole world thought I had failed. They thought I was a heartbroken girl pushed aside by a charismatic stepmother. They were wrong. I was the quiet curator of a very complex, decade-long plan. The final, essential message from this whole nightmare is this: don't let people victimize you in their narrative. Take the time to understand the rules of the game they're playing. The people who tell the loudest lies often ignore the quiet, immutable laws of structure and truth. They look for fire and fury, but the facts? They're hidden in the most logical, most ignored place. I'm starting a new life now. I'm running the company my mother built, and I'm using the profits to rebuild the old Northside Library wing in her honor. A small gesture, perhaps, but one that honors the greatest lesson she ever taught me. The system is flawed. The people are deceptive. But the truth, if you know where to look, is always filed correctly. So, you've heard the whole story. You've seen how a single, carefully placed memory can dismantle a decade of lies. You've seen how justice isn't always served in court, but in the calculated execution of a brilliant, deceased woman's final wishes. Have you ever found the truth hiding in the very place you were told to forget? Have you realized that the key to your freedom was a tiny detail you almost missed? Share your thoughts below. I read every comment, and I'll see you soon for the next installment behind closed doors. There are always more secrets waiting to be filed. This is the continuation of the story, following the established tone and structure. I will now write the continuation of the story, focusing on the character's internal thoughts and establishing the next phase of her life. Chapter 7. The Inheritance of Silence, the New Normal. I didn't change the locks again at 8:01 p.m. I changed them at 7:59 p.m. A subtle declaration. A final, silent acknowledgement that the house, the home, was mine, down to the minute. Victoria's abandoned possessions, piled in the driveway for immediate donation, were a monument to her rushed retreat. They were expensive, garish, and utterly disposable. She only ever understood value on a balance sheet. She never grasped permanence. The days that followed weren't a celebration. They were a slow, steady detox. My father left for his travels within a week, a quiet promise in his eyes that he would return when the scent of Victoria's betrayal had finally lifted from the air. He needed the world to remind him who he was, outside of the women who had defined his life. I understood. Some truths are too bright. You need distance to process the burn. I lived in the house in a state of controlled minimalism. I ate takeout on the kitchen floor, surrounded by boxes of my mother's returned books, all smelling faintly of library dust and justice. I slept in my old bedroom, the one space Victoria hadn't dared to fully redecorate, and every morning I went to the study. The study, my mother's sanctuary, was now the control center. I sat at her desk, running my hands over the smooth, worn wood. It was here she'd told me that a good librarian is the quiet architect of civilization, organizing the chaos of knowledge. That wisdom now applied to my own life. I spent weeks meticulously going through the corporate documents of Vance Publishing. Victoria, for all her social acumen, had been a terrible businesswoman. She'd leveraged the company's assets for her own luxury, bleeding the accounts slowly, relying on the assumption that she'd eventually own everything outright. Her focus was on the show, not the substance. Internal monologue, she was all velvet curtains and no foundation. She used the company to fund a lifestyle, not to foster creativity. It was the antithesis of everything my mother believed in. The firm was successful, yes, but fragile. It needed a quiet, precise hand to stabilize it. The first staff meeting was tense. I walked into the mahogany-paneled boardroom, the room where Victoria had held court. I was 28, dressed in a simple, sharp suit, facing 40 executives who were used to high-octane drama and extravagant promises. I gave them neither. "The legal battles are over," I said, my voice steady, professional. "The rightful ownership has been confirmed. I am the chairwoman and CEO. You've been through a decade of uncertainty and a year of open litigation. That ends today." I looked directly at Mr. Harrison, the CFO, who had worked under Victoria and looked perpetually anxious. "Mr. Harrison, I have the full forensic audit results from Uncle Liam's team. The spending under the previous administration was excessive. We will be implementing immediate cost controls and pivoting back to our core mission. We are not a vanity project. We are a publishing house committed to literary quality." I didn't fire anyone that day. I didn't need to. I gave them facts, not threats. The facts were enough to make it clear that the era of lavish expenses and superficiality was over. The company either adapted to my mother's standards of excellence and rigor, or it would fail. The final piece of the puzzle was the will itself. The original, authenticated document was now secured in a high-security vault. But the book, the careful curator, remained in my possession. I kept it locked in a small, fireproof safe in the study. It wasn't a document anymore. It was a relic. A reminder that the simplest solution is often the most brilliant. A small part of me, the cynical daughter Victoria had created, wanted to know if she had faced any consequences beyond the loss of the estate. Uncle Liam confirmed the status. "We didn't press the perjury charges, Alara. Not yet. We settled for the forfeiture of all assets, which, frankly, is a cleaner, faster outcome. But the threat is there. She knows we have the evidence of the cut bag, and her statement. She's neutralized. Neutralized. I liked the sound of that. She was legally silenced, financially ruined, and psychologically defeated. She was forced to live with the knowledge that her own greed was the instrument of her undoing. I sat alone in the large, quiet house one evening, looking at the city lights. My life was now the definition of high stakes. I was a young woman running a major company, responsible for hundreds of jobs and a legacy of intellectual honesty. The emotional roller coaster had stopped, replaced by the relentless drive of responsibility. I knew my journey wasn't over. Victoria was a single snake, but the swamp of high-stakes corporate life was filled with others. My mother had prepared me for the immediate threat. Now I had to prepare for the long war. The war of sustaining the truth in a world that craves the comfortable lie. I was the new quiet keeper, the curator of both my inheritance and my mother's moral clarity. My vengeance was complete, but my work, my actual meaningful work, was just beginning.